Greetings everyone, I am RST. This is my Talis guide, and I'll be going over both Force and Techter in this video. Starting with the PA and Tech, the Talis has all the basic skills, from Downward Slam, Hip Counter, and Basic Attack. The single target bread and butter of the Talis is a Convergent Shot. Convergent Shot deploys your Talis so that way you will have a single target blast when you use a tech. This blast will take on the element of the tech you use, and can use any one of the elements. Next we have Spread Shot, which is the Talis's AoE option. Spread Shot has a cleave setting and an AoE setting. The cleave setting can be deployed by not following through with the AoE portion of the attack, by either using another attack or by dodging out of it. While the cleave is deployed, you will shoot 3 orbs out in front of you, and they will all hit each enemy once. In comparison, the AoE version of Spread Shot will be an AoE around you, damaging all enemies within range. The weapon action of the Talis can be used to dodge. It does not have a counter and sets up a turret that will shoot enemies and recover PP for you. This turret lasts quite a while. Tricky Capacitor is a build-up ability of the Talis. As you use abilities, you charge up a gauge to expand on a Tricky Capacitor, which does a large amount of damage and restores PP. Use Tricky Capacitor on cooldown if possible, or save for weak spots where applicable. The Talis has access to all techs, and for this reason can use all of them. However, the Talis mostly relies on its AoE techs, not its single target techs. More importantly, the two most important I personally find are Pso2 and Zondi, for those are the ones I will talk about here. Charge Pso2 is a fiery explosion and does AoE to all enemies around it. The reason I include this here is the Pso2 brand skill, causing it to do more damage the more you use it. This makes it strictly better than the alternative AoE for the Talis in my opinion. And if enemies are clumped up, it is a rival to Zondi, which is the other tech I will talk about today. Zondi of course hit enemies to eventually charge up a proc, to then unleash a charge Zondi that does more damage, and is the AoE bread and butter of the tech classes currently. Compound Tech. All the compound techs are fairly close together in output, so I recommend using the one that is best for the situation that you are doing. If your enemy is weak to wind, use Landion. If your enemy is weak to ice, use Bariston, and if your enemy is weak to fire, use Vermelgon. The peanut butter of the Talis is an AoE area that strikes in the middle. The last hit deals more damage. Let's move into the skill tree. I'll not be going too much into the Force and Techter skill trees here, as my main priority here is the Talis and not going too much into depth of classes, though I will point out skills that give that class an edge. Starting with Talis specific skills, we have Tricky Capacitor, Tricky Capacitor Quick Recharge, and Tricky Capacitor Gauge Amp. These all affect the Talis's skill Tricky Capacitor as well as unlock it. The Tricky Capacitor Quick Recharge is Force only, and allows for increased recharge of the Tricky Capacitor gauge after Tricky Capacitor is used. Tricky Capacitor Gauge Amp increases your Tricky Capacitor gauge increase while your Talis is deployed with either Spread Shot or Convergent Shot. Talis Bloom after PP restores PP based on the amount of PP that you spent while the Talis was. Talis Bloom Revoke cancel the deploy of your Spread Shot or Convergent Shot by holding the weapon action. Does not trigger Talis Bloom after PP gain. Splitting Pillbox Multi-Rock. When weapon action is activated, attack multiple enemies intermittently for a set time by not performing a directional inputs. This one is probably skippable, as personally I'm always moving when I'm using Talis. The main reason is I'm not too confident at dodging the step dodge, and the Talis weapon action dodge can be finicky. Notable tech. The Talis has access to all the tech skills, but only go over Pso2 brand and Zondi clad. Pso2 brand unlocks the ability for Pso2 techniques to build up brand on target enemies, and then explode for damage once you use an additional fire tech. Zondi clad is fairly similar. You hit enemies until you gain a charge of Subclass, and then you charge up a Zondi, and it will strike for additional damage. United Attack can be unlocked in the skill tree. They cost 0 skill points, so be sure to grab them. Force skills. The PP conversion line, allowing you to be more PP efficient with your Talis, even though the Talis is already fairly PP efficient. PP recovery boost and eradication PP gain are definitely needed if you're using Spread Shot of the Talis, because the Talis Spread Shot options drain PP like crazy. Photon Flare after PP, and Photon Flare Short Cycle. If you're using Force as your main class, you definitely want to tech into these, as they increase your output with the Talis. Though you definitely do not want to run Photon Flare Short Charge, as you are not charging techs actively as a Talis user, and you may as well want to pick up Technique Domination as you will be using techs on enemies when they are down. As an AoE circumstance, you may prefer to use techs to hit multiple enemies instead. Techter skills. The active Techter skills are always to be taken. Shifted event, overemphasis are main class that are important if you're running Techter as a main class, regardless of whether you're using Wand or Talis. Weak Element Amp and Awake Isle are very important for the Techter class to run, and are very important as running main class or a subclass. The reason for this is they increase the rate at which your photon burst is up. More peanut butter means more damage. Let's talk about subclass. For subclass, it really depends on which one you're maining. If you're maining Techter, I really feel like to get the optimal power out of the Techter Talis, you are forced to go for sub. A big part of this is Techter just does not have access to all the skills that the Talis needs. Therefore, Force is probably the better option here, and Techters are seemingly forced to take Force as a subclass in this case, though they can suboptimally run Bouncer, whereas Force can run either or. Force in this case is fairly independent and doesn't really need to have Techter as a subclass to make the most out of this skill. And Bouncer just arguably gives more to Force than Techter does in this circumstance. Having a higher down rate is much better than having photon gauge increases, but Force does miss out on many skill overlaps if you don't take Techter as a sub. Rod vs Talis. Now, a big problem with running Force is why would you ever not use a Rod versus a Talis? The Rod has a better weapon action, a better peanut butter, and overall just seems to output way more damage. So why would you ever use the Talis over the Rod? Well, you can always use the Talis' weapon action to supplement the first Rod, increasing the Rod's PP consistency. But that's not all. Convergent Shot seemingly charges the gauges for compound techniques a lot faster than the Rod does. But realistically, that's the only leg up that the Talis has over the Rod. Though this interaction mainly comes from the fact that the techniques need to build up something, whereas the Talis Bolt does not, and just restores an ample amount of United Technique every single time. Using Talis, you could use the Rod Peanut Butter to increase your damage further. Wand vs Talis. Well, this is a bit more interesting than Rod vs Talis. While I do not know specifically how the Wand or Hammer compares to the Talis in output, I can say that these are two different beasts we're comparing here. We're comparing a ranged to a melee. The Wand does have a better counter than the Talis, but the Talis is more ranged optimized than the Wand is. Arguably anyway, as Techters can still use techs. And though in the case of Techter, the Talis may have more output than just using techs on a Wand, though I am no expert on this. Talis strategies. Using techs versus Talis abilities. I've mentioned before that seemingly techs have their time and place with Talis, as the AoE options of Talis are fairly lacking, and the techs seem to have the AoE aspect covered a lot better than say the Talis spread shot does, though it can feel pretty rewarding to hit many enemies with spread shot all at once. I mean, at least you look cool doing it. Cleave versus AoE. If you do decide to use spread shot, hold off for a moment. Do you need to use the full AoE, or is the spread shot's first form significantly better for the situation you're in? If it's not a larger AoE situation where enemies are everywhere all around you, then just hitting enemies in front of you is adequate enough and will do enough damage, as well as will compete with the techs a lot better, keeping the turret up. Now, if you're watching the gameplay in the background, you may have noticed that I struggle to keep the turret up, and I will completely acknowledge that here, but it is important to maximize your DPS by keeping your turret up at all times. This just increases your PP consistency, but I only recommend using it immediately after using Convergent Shot. Next up, make use of your range. You are a ranged tech class if you have to rely on your range to get out of AoEs, but do remember that you can step dodge to maximize your damage, so if you are confident enough to try, do so. PP management, dump rotation. The Talis clearly goes with a dump rotation, especially with the fact that it can restore its PP pool, and if you can keep your Talis turret up, then this rotation is even more effective, as you do not need to use your basic attack as often. Force vs Techter. Force is clearly the better option for a class when playing the Talis, but you don't lose much benefit from playing as Techter as your main class either, as you do gain access to the powerful buffs that Techter does bring to the battlefield. The Talis is viable on both, though I will say again that if you're going for full out damage, that the Talis is better on the Force in this case. I've been RSV, I hope my Talis guide was useful, and I will see you next time.